Welcome back. In this lecture, I want to talk about a series of Jewish thinkers' attempts to come to grips with the enormous historical and theological trauma of what happened to the Jewish people in the 20th century, especially in the Shoah, or the Holocaust. Now, when I talk about this, I'll use this word Shoah a lot, and I do that on purpose. Holocaust is a Greek word that means burnt offering. It's often used religiously as a sacrificial word. This is clearly not a good word to talk about the genocide that affected the Jewish people and many others in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and Western Europe, all over Europe, really, in the middle of the 20th century. Shoah is a biblical Hebrew word that means catastrophe. Now, there's an enormous debate about whether or not the Holocaust, the Shoah, is like other genocides. There are some important differences between the Shoah and other genocides that it's worth noting. Other genocides, Rwanda, maybe Cambodia, maybe the suffering of the Armenians in Ottoman Turkey, seem localized to a people in one country. If the people weren't in that country, they would perhaps be safe. The Shoah exposed a Nazi plan to annihilate Jews around the world. It was a global ambition. Plus, the Shoah was clearly part of the intrinsic war strategy of the Third Reich itself, to the point where, in fact, important military costs were borne by the Third Reich so that they could kill more Jewish men, women, and children. And they killed a lot. In the course of the whole Shoah, which really gets going in a serious way in 1940, 1941, more than 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, all of them, of course, civilians, are murdered. And also another 6 million other men, women, and children, again, all of them civilians, also die. The way we imagine the Shoah, by and large today, is that most people we imagine are killed in death camps and by industrial teams of the SS, the Nazi death guards. But this is in fact not true. Most of the victims, most of the Jews and other victims of the Shoah, were killed where they lived, almost at once, by the German army when it came through. There were, of course, special units dedicated to killing, but sometimes normal army units just took it upon themselves to massacre whatever Jews they could find, especially on the Eastern Front. And while the Holocaust, the Shoah, takes place across the whole scope of the Second World War, much of the orgy of killing actually happens in the 13 or 14 months between around September 1941 and October and November 1942. That's when most of what we know of as the Holocaust actually happens. At the end of the Second World War, the experience of the Shoah was one that most people simply had never had any precedent to understand. People couldn't process what had happened. When the first images were shown in a movie theater in London, Arthur Kazin, an American writer who was in the US Army there, said that there were curious outbursts of laughter by people around him. Not because people found it humorous at all, but because no one could process the information that their eyes were trying to convey to their brains. They look at these images, they look at these pictures of stick figures, and they just kind of burst out laughing, like, what do you do to that? That sort of laughter. And it's hard for us now to imagine what it was like 60 years ago to live in a world where no one really had processed this thought of piles and piles of people, basically as thin as sticks, who had been turned into those victims on an intentional and industrial basis. Martha Gellhorn, a very hard-bitten war correspondent, was one of the first reporters to visit Dachau. And when she was there, she went all through the camp. Dachau was one of the death camps. And she wrote, after she came out, an article which still is something I think that people should read now. At the end of the article about what she saw in Dachau, she said, "We've all seen a great deal now. We have seen too many wars and too much violent dying. We've seen hospitals, bloody and messy as butcher shops. We have seen the dead like bundles lying on all the roads of half the earth. But nowhere was there anything like this. Nothing about war was ever as insanely wicked as the starved and outraged, naked, nameless dead. It took a long time, really, genuinely a long time, for people to begin to process what the Holocaust, what the Shoah meant. There's a wonderful book by a historian named Peter Novick entitled The Holocaust in American Life, which is a study of how it took decades for Americans to think in direct ways about the nature and meaning and implications, religious, philosophical, moral, political, of this event. Nothing has so profoundly challenged, though, Jews in particular, and the Jewish faith in general, as the Holocaust did, as the Shoah did, since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 CE. That is, after the war, Jewish thinkers began slowly to try to come to terms with the challenge of the events and the implication they had for the basic principles of their faith. In this lecture, I want to look at how four people in particular, four major Jewish thinkers in particular, have thought about this issue. First, I want to talk about Richard Rubinstein, then Arthur Cohen, Emil Fackenheim, and then Emmanuel Levinas. Let me talk about Rubinstein first. Rubinstein is a living American Jewish philosopher at present, famous perhaps most for his book After Auschwitz, a book that was published in 1966 and is really the first book to argue from the inside of the Jewish faith about the implications of the Shoah for Judaism. Now, for traditional rabbinic Judaism, Rubinstein argued, the Shoah must be understood either as a punishment or a complete mystery. He chooses the latter and says that this, in fact, shows the bankruptcy of some traditional Jewish understandings of theology. That is, some traditional Jewish understandings of the picture of God. Not the understanding of the people Israel in general, but their understanding of who God was, what God had covenanted to do, and what God was able to do now. Rubinstein's argument was simple: to posit a just and omnipotent God who was in covenant with the people Israel and directly, providentially governing their fate and the fate of the world entails affirming that this God directly willed the murder of 6 million Jews and 6 million others. No one in their right mind would affirm that directly. Therefore, Rubinstein argues, we have to have a vision of God as effectively dead. For this God, the God of traditional Jewish faith, could not have allowed the Shoah had this God been alive. Furthermore, Rubinstein wants to suggest that the Shoah shows that the people Israel are not in any important way the chosen of God. Though their rituals have meaning and purpose, their practices, their forms of belief help them live and provide order to their lives, ultimately the Shoah breaks apart any living relationship we could have with traditional Judaism, he thinks. The covenant made between Yahweh and the people Israel was broken in Auschwitz, he says. The thread uniting God and man, heaven and earth, has been broken. And he says, whatever else you want to say, however else you want to start, you've got to begin with that fact that beyond all the actual concrete human suffering, immeasurable human suffering of the Shoah, there is the theological fact that all this means that this God is clearly not a God that we're dealing with now. So what does that mean? Should the Jews stop being Jews? No, he thinks. No, a more profound questioning should happen, a far more morally serious questioning of what a God is doing now, if there is a God, and what the people Israel should do in the wake of the traditional Yahweh's demise. The insistence here is that the resistance to rejecting entirely the identity of the Jew is partially something really important that we need to keep, that resistance is something we need to keep alive, those of us who are Jews, precisely because to allow that to lapse is in some important way to continue the defeat that the Shoah represents of much of the people Israel. This is an astonishing book. It came out almost out of nowhere, really, and it literally created the genre of post-Holocaust theology. That is, after Rubinstein had started writing, people began to imagine it's possible to think about Judaism in light of this. Before him, no one had had the courage, really. No one had had the intellectual gumption to try to think about what it meant to be a Jew in the wake of this enormously annihilating event. And almost all the work that came after it felt compelled to respond to him. One of the most interesting ones to respond was Arthur Cohen, who was an American Jewish thinker and writer and philosopher. He lived from 1928 to 1986. In his book, The Tremendum, argued for a vision of the camps as a profound and profane series of sites of anti-holiness. A new kind of evil was revealed in the camps, the evil of the tremendum. Now, tremendum is a Latin word that means the terrible or the terror, but it also means the awesome, the thing that is amazing. He doesn't mean it to have the positive inflection there, but he does want to capture the negative inflection. For Cohen, what the Shoah teaches, the crucial thing he wants to take from this experience, is that we must see the reality of the camps for what they represent and the overall Shoah, not simply to treat them as continuous with other anti-Semitic pogroms that had come before. For after all, Jews have always suffered. Historically, as we talked about in the Rabbinic Judaism lecture, there had always been this history of Jewish suffering as part of the cost of bearing the sign of being the elect of God. But Cohen thinks this is a new kind of thing. This is the tremendum. There's something new and troubling here. The Holocaust is unique. It can't be grouped with other kinds of annihilationism. Nor is there any sort of moral to this story. The Shoah is the tremendum, an utter break with all past events. Now, given that, how should we think about God after the Shoah? How should we think about God in light of these events? Cohen is clear here, as clear as he thinks he can be, that God's silence suggests a kind of divine acquiescence, he says, in the work of murder and destruction. Because of this, the human can break the bond with God. The people of Israel can break the covenant. The abyss of the historical has torn asunder that covenant. The tremendum has ripped apart the garments that bonded the people of Israel to their God. But in fact, this just shows that we, and Cohen here is speaking of the Jewish people in general, had been worshiping an idol of our own fabrication. The tremendum shows us that this God is not the real God, not the real Yahweh we should be following. And a wonderful passage in Cohen here. Let me find this. He says, if we begin to see God less as an interferer whose insertion is welcome when it accords with our needs, and more as the immensity whose reality is our prefiguration, right? In other words, the promise of what we will be, what we hope to become. We shall have won a sense of God, whom we may love and honor, but whom we no longer fear, and from whom we no longer demand. Now, what does this mean? It means that God, the God that Cohen wants the Jews to profess, this God is more of a promise at present, not fully realized. This God will be realized in the future, but not yet. This God is not here for us now. Now, Rubinstein and Cohen are both, in important ways, American Jews thinking seriously about the experience of the Shoah from an American context. Emil Fackenheim, the third of our thinkers, is someone who actually experienced it firsthand. He was born and raised in Germany, a promising young man who was picked up with his family and sent with his family to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp by the Nazis when he was in his early 20s. He managed to escape from the camp and with his younger brother made his way eventually to Canada. His parents eventually got out of the camp as well and made it to Canada also. But his older brother never managed to escape, and he was killed in the Shoah. Now, Fackenheim asks in his magisterial work, very important work in post-Holocaust theology, called To Mend the World, he asks a basic question. After the Shoah, who is a Jew? What is a Jew? This is always a question for Jews. Who is a Jew? What does it mean to be a Jew? So Fackenheim says, after the Shoah, we ask it again. What does it mean? The Jew is one who, Fackenheim thinks, without the historical accident of Hitler's losing the war, would be dead or would have never been born. That's really important. Think about that for a second. The new identity of the Jew is one who, absent the sheer historical luck of Hitler's defeat, would not be. The identity of the Jewish people, the identity of each individual Jew, has been profoundly transformed by Hitler's deeds, and especially the Shoah. And so Fackenheim brilliantly and famously argues that the Jews must refuse to give Hitler any posthumous victories. We must undertake again, the Jewish people must undertake again, Fackenheim thought, the Jewish practice of tikkun olam. That's a Hebrew words that mean to mend the world. This is why the title of his book is To Mend the World. This is a general ethical obligation, always for Jews, Fackenheim thinks. But after the Shoah, after the Holocaust, it takes on a new specificity as well. To heal the world is, among other things, simply to practice resistance to the evil aim of the Holocaust itself. And the evil aim of the Holocaust was to annihilate the Jewish people altogether. Remember that in traditional Jewish theology, the Jewish people are not simply for themselves. The Jewish people are the elect of God, not because God has chosen them and will take them away eventually, right? But because God is going to save the world through the Jews. To attack the Jews, from the Jews' own perspective, to attack the Jews is to attack the whole world, to annihilate the very link between the God who will redeem the world and the world that desperately needs redemption. To heal the world, then, there must be a Jewish people. And the first obligation of the Jews, for everybody, for everyone's sake, is to ensure that the people of Israel continue. Now, how do they continue? This is where Fackenheim offers some particular concrete suggestions. Jews must recover. They must recover the past of the Jewish tradition. They must put themselves back in living continuity and living exchange with that tradition. They must begin to recover from the trauma of the Shoah itself. They must reconstitute their people, reconstitute their population, their communities. And they also must recognize that both of these recoveries, the recovery of the past and the recovery from the Shoah, in themselves and in their mutual interrelation, will never be complete. They will always be incomplete. Furthermore, Fackenheim says, the name for all of these obligations, the name for this fundamental effort to mend the world, is something that Fackenheim proposes that we call the 614th commandment. Traditionally, in Rabbinic Judaism, people thought there were 613 mitzvot, 613 laws that Jews had to follow. Fackenheim wants to add just one. And it's a doozy. It's a wonderful, wonderful statement, and a relatively famous one. We are first commanded to survive as Jews, lest the Jewish people perish. We are commanded, secondly, to remember in our very guts and bones the martyrs of the Holocaust, lest their memory perish. So already Fackenheim is saying this is about recovering the past. We are forbidden, thirdly, to deny or despair of God, however much we may have to contend with him or with belief in him, lest Judaism perish. We are forbidden, finally, to despair of the world as a place which is to become the kingdom of God, lest we help make it a meaningless place in which God is dead or irrelevant and everything is permitted. To abandon any of these imperatives in response to Hitler's victory at Auschwitz would be to hand him yet posthumous victories. To talk about this nest of practices he thinks is so important and compelling, Fackenheim uses a term, a very old and traditional term in Judaism, called teshuvah. Teshuvah is a matter of turning normally in terms of repentance, but Fackenheim means to turn to God, turning to God as human, so that God and human meet face to face. That for him is the core of Judaism for him. And what is called for after the Shoah is the rejuvenation of that encounter, the rejuvenation of teshuvah. Now, to move from Fackenheim into Emanuel Levinas is to move from someone writing in really fundamentally an American register. Fackenheim eventually becomes an American and Canadian scholar of real import, someone who's writing in a very clear and public way, to talk about someone with Emanuel Levinas who's an enormously philosophically complicated and ingrown intellectual thinker, intellectual presence in the world. One of the most important postmodern philosophers, Emanuel Levinas is, and a thinker of real profundity. He was born in 1906 as a Lithuanian, a young Jewish Lithuanian, and he moved to Germany and studied with Husserl and Heidegger, two major philosophers. Husserl Jewish, Heidegger not, and eventually Heidegger siding with the Nazis, before he emigrates to France in the 1930s. While he survived World War II in a prison camp, and his wife and daughter survived hidden in a monastery, his father, his mother-in-law, and all his brothers were killed in the Shoah. After the war, he rebuilt his life, he rejoined his family, and he worked quietly for decades, doing his own writing, engaging in intellectual debate, and only in the 70s, 80s, and then 90s, as he became a very old man, was he recognized as an incredible intellectual, philosophical, and moral force, one of the people who redeemed Europe after the events of the Shoah. And at the center of a lot of his work is actually his notion of evil, and especially around the category of suffering. Evil for Levinas is fundamentally suffering. And what does this mean? Well, it means that evil is the experience of agents, active beings, you and I, being turned into something wholly fundamentally passive, being turned into not agents, into what we are essentially not by the action of another upon us. Now, Levinas's sense of suffering, in some sense then, is of radical passivity. It's more radically passive than our senses, because the senses are modes of receptivity, and thus welcome what they are given in the way of sense data. I said that relatively quickly, but let me say it again. Sense data, that is, the wavelengths of light or whatever, are welcomed by me and received by my eyes, because my eyes are designed to receive them. In other words, it takes them and knows what to do with them in some important way. That's the part of me that's supposed to be receptive. Suffering is not that. Suffering is not me receiving things. Suffering is just what happens. It's through evil, in a way, that suffering is understood, through the category of evil. Suffering is, in an important way, per se, in itself, it is evil. Why is that? Because the activity of being caused to suffer means that I am no longer an actor. I am merely a passive recipient of something. But reception, again, sounds too much like it's something I'm collaborating in. I don't receive suffering like a gift. I don't ever receive it in that way. It just happens to me. Suffering, in whatever form it is, mockery, physical violence, murder, it always is on a trajectory of turning humans into what they are essentially not, turning humans into corpses, or at least potential corpses, right? That's what suffering does for Levinas. Evil, then, on this account, is radically negative. It affirms the presence of the victims only insofar as, and no further than, it needs the victim's existence in order to annihilate it, right? Evil, that is, only seeks out people as potential targets of its own malice. This kind of evil, Levinas thinks, is radically gratuitous, and in no good sense of the term gratuitous. It is excessive in a way precisely because it seeks out being in the world and attempts to turn it into not being, attempts to turn it into what it is essentially not. Furthermore, this suffering is radically meaningless in itself, he thinks. The essay where he most famously talks about this is an essay called Useless Suffering. So the suffering is radically meaningless in itself and useless in itself. It cannot be intrinsically made useful for us. There is strictly no sense to be given to such suffering, since precisely suffering is the annihilation of sense. The annihilation of those agents who are, in some sense, the only creatures able to make sense. Right? Pain, then, is not something which is intrinsically for our benefit or for our blessing. Pain is, strictly speaking, nonsense. It has no meaning and offers no intelligibility. In fact, pain and suffering are, for Levinas, precisely the opposite of meaning. They are the annihilation of meaning, precisely because meaning is what is made by agents, and they are the annihilation of agents. Now, of course, suffering, for me, when it's my suffering, can have meaning insofar as I choose to undergo this suffering in order to end someone else's suffering, right? If I see someone being assaulted and beaten within an inch of their life, I can run over and stop it, or at least try to interfere so that the attackers, start beating me as well, so I can drag the person away, perhaps. In that activity, I suffer suffering. I suffer assaults on my being, right? Intrinsically, those assaults, those punches, those kicks have no meaning. But in the narrative that I'm offering, they do have meaning, because I suffer that senseless pain in order to stop another from suffering more senseless pain. But that is not to say that suffering itself can in itself be justified. No such justification exists. The pain of a suffering person at the hands of another is not warranted or merited by anything. It is just, strictly speaking, evil. Now, in a way, Levinas turns out to take Fackenheim's argument and universalize it in a certain sense. Fackenheim, right, argued that you have to remain a Jew after Auschwitz. After Auschwitz, Levinas says, it's not just Jews. All people must care for one another in a new way. They must care for one another to seek out those situations where people are being caused to suffer in this way, where people are being asked to disappear in their beings, to be annihilated. And now the obligation to turn to God, which Fackenheim thinks is the fundamental obligation of all Jews after the Shoah. Levinas says the fundamental obligation of all people after the Shoah is to turn to one another, to turn to your fellow humans and see them, and see if you can stop whatever suffering is happening to them. And it is only through that effort to stop suffering that any of our sufferings will ever have any meaning, will ever have any purpose. So you can see how Levinas is simultaneously a Jewish thinker, but also one who takes a Jewish message, a kind of Jewish gospel of sorts, out to the world as a whole, universalizing the obligation to change your being after the experience of the Shoah. Now, all four of these thinkers are in complicated ways very seriously self-identifying themselves in their writing as essentially Jewish thinkers who are writing for others to hear, but also importantly for the Jewish people. Now, Levinas, in his work, is much vaguer on this, especially in the stuff we've been working on, but still, he thinks of himself as in some rich continuity with the Jewish tradition and working out of that tradition in important ways. Next, we turn to a Jewish thinker who is by no means less Jewish than they, no means less influenced, nor any less interested in Jewish themes, but whose views on the Holocaust and the Shoah were not centrally about its implications for the Jewish tradition, but about its implications for the world as a whole, and who is unarguably still the most controversial thinker of the Shoah, and arguably the greatest thinker of human genocide and mass political evil in the modern world, and that will be Hannah Arendt.